what Europe tries to, and what European entrepreneurs can adopt as a competitive advantage is that they can go around the world pitching their AI systems, pitching their AI products as being the ones that are most compliant with the most stringent regulation in the world. And that provides citizens and consumers in other regions with a lot of trust in these products. So I'd say that's also the final element and how Europe tries to position itself in this very competitive global market.
Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government, and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome back to the AI Government in the Future podcast. I'm your host, Marc Leh, and today I'm thrilled to have Giorgos Verdi join us. Giorgos is a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and an influential voice shaping the digital landscape across Europe. His work focuses on ensuring that technological advancement, particularly AI, aligns with responsible and inclusive principles that benefit all of society. He has collaborated extensively with the European Parliament and the Council of Europe, a variety of tech startups, bringing strategic foresight to some of the most crucial decision makers in the tech and government arenas. Today, we'll explore the complex world of AI regulation, the implications of the EU's pioneering AI Act, and the broader impacts of these regulations on Europe's role in the global tech race. Giorgos will also share insights on the cultural and structural challenges that shape Europe's tech industry compared to global counterparts. So welcome, Giorgos. Thanks for joining us.
It's great being here.
Awesome. Well, to kick things off, could you share a little bit of background on your journey in the technology policy industry and what initially drew you to focus on AI and its intersection with government and regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I would say that the story begins with my parents, which is the classic story of two immigrants who arrived to a European Union country coming from a former communist country with very little to their name and managed through hard work and determination to build a life and provide their children with countless opportunities. Now, this was about 30 years ago. Today, in Europe and in the United States, people are much more pessimistic about their future, and the story of my parents seems to be out of reach. But technology and AI specifically provided a younger version of me with a lot of hope for the future. I believed and still do that technology and AI can help all citizens achieve their dreams as long as these technologies are being deployed and developed with human-centered goals in mind. Imagine, for example, the potential that AI provides for quality healthcare through medical AI applications that can enhance the roles of doctors and nurses, or the role that AI assistants can play in education and providing a more enhanced education experience for all children out there. Building this kind of future requires intentionality from our part, because if we don't build AI and technologies with human-centered values in our mind, these technologies will just exacerbate existing divisions and existing problems. So it's up to us to choose what values we want these technologies to embody. And that's why I decided to dedicate my career in helping policymakers come up with different instruments, either regulations or strategies, to help them implement this vision.
Great. And if you don't mind elaborating a little bit more on your current role and current work and focus as a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, I guess, are you able to operate in that mission space in your current position?
Absolutely. That's a very exciting project we are right now doing, because with ECFR, we have actually launched a new project in defining the next 5 years of Europe's technology agenda. So we have the European elections now in May 2024. We have now the re-election of the Commission President. We have new commissioners coming in. And right now, it's a very dynamic and very interesting period, because these new policymakers, these new government officials will set the priorities that will define the next 5 years in Europe. And so what we're trying to do with ECFR is research and provide solid recommendations of how Europe can take advantage of the next 5 years in order to not stay behind, but actually go in a trajectory of leadership.
That's really exciting and actually analogous to some of the work that, our firm Corner Alliance does here in the United States, not necessarily looking at policy road mapping, but technology road mapping, informing the, potential priorities and positioning of programs based on current trends, drivers, opportunities, and technology gaps. And so that does sound like a really exciting project. I guess as part of that policy opportunity identification, are there any sort of guiding principles or values or specific elements of the technology market that are of particular interest to you when making those recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd say that the one of the main areas of focus right now for us, but also for many people working in this area in Europe, is innovation. Absolutely. And that is because we have identified that Europe suffers from an innovation gap in many of critical and emerging technologies, including AI. And as these technologies are in their turn absolutely essential for the economic and competitive future of our continent, we believe that it is right now the time to take some decisions to start closing at this gap. So innovation is a central point of view that we're approaching this issue from. And the other very important leg of our research also has to do with economic security. And that mainly concerns the fact that we're living in a very geopolitical world where there is a lot of contestation of emerging and critical technologies, and where states have to also protect their industrial bases, either from leakage of sensitive information, from espionage. So we believe that's another opportunity, that's another challenge that must become a priority in the next 5 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point and certainly a priority here in the States as well. I know I've done a lot of work supporting various initiatives within the Chips for America Act, looking at increasing the US supply chain resiliency and effectiveness, supporting microelectronics, semiconductor manufacturing. And so I don't know if there are, parallel policies that Europe is considering right now, for lack of a better term, potentially onshoring or increasing the traceability of various elements or enabling technologies supporting high priority use cases like AI. But I guess any specific examples of policies that might share a certain flavor to that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that semiconductors, chips are absolutely a central case study that manifests what we're just saying about economic security. Europe specifically is reliant on about 75% of its chips from importing them from Asia. So that makes the whole continent very vulnerable to any kind of geopolitical disruptions or any kind of supply chain disruptions that might occur in the region. And so what the European Union decided to do a couple of years ago was pursue a policy that is similar, I'd say, to the United States in many regards, introducing a regulation called the European Chips Act, but which is a bit different from the traditional European regulation in the sense that it doesn't introduce obligations for producers or safety standards, but it actually puts in place money. It tries to mobilize investments, either public or private, in order to start onshoring some of advanced cutting edge chip production, but also putting in place contingency plans. So right now, the European member states are working on scenarios of what happens in case there is in the chip supply chain, and how can Europe respond to that scenario very quickly and not take ages, weeks, months in order to come up with a plan. So I think CEMIC is a case study where the US and Europe have approached this in a very similar fashion.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by kind of the comparison between how the US government and the European Union conducts business, obviously different cultures, priorities, and mechanisms by setting policy and priorities, gathering requirements and things of that nature. But it sounds like a lot of the core motivation remains consistent across both continents. I think we can probably dig into some semiconductor focused discussion a little bit later, but I did want to acknowledge that as of the date of this recording, the European Union's AI Act is set to come into force on August 1st, tomorrow. And I think this is obviously a very landmark piece of legislation or policy, given that it is, to my knowledge, kind of the first, wide-ranging AI policy measure being enacted at kind of a multinational scale. So I think there's obviously a lot of requirements and attention that the policy has received over the past several years, given that it has been a long policy development life cycle and voting and things of that nature. And so I did want to get your take on maybe just providing some background on what is the underlying motivation for enacting this policy? What does it hope to achieve, knowing that the policy may place some restrictions or controls on use cases that may be, high risk or unacceptable risk, making it a little bit more obvious or transparent for the public to understand when they are interacting with AI systems, and maybe just emphasizing transparency across the kind of foundational models or specific vendors providing products and services powered by AI. But I guess from your perspective, being obviously very well versed in European policy development and some of the trends, drivers of affecting and driving policy in Europe, what is that underlying motivation, and what, from your perspective, does the EU AI Act hope to achieve?
Yeah. So I'd say there were two kind of like factors that went into European policymakers thinking when coming up with an AI Act, with the words first AI regulation, essentially. The first consideration has to do, of course, with AI risks. And in Europe, we had quite a few high profile cases where AI systems posed some significant risks to either vulnerable populations or individual people. And so policymakers were motivated from such case studies, such as one high-profile case study in the Netherlands, where Dutch government implemented AI systems into their child benefits administrative process, which ended up being very faulty and harming thousands of Dutch citizens. And so, in an attempt to protect citizens and consumers from these harms, the AI Act exactly introduces, as we describe, this risk-based approach, which regulates AI systems based on the risk that they pose for citizens and consumers. So the first kind of consideration for EU policymakers was definitely these risks and trying to protect human rights from the abuses and the threat that these systems pose. Now, there was a second leg as well, which I think tends to be overlooked in these discussions, but it is equally important when listening to European policymakers. And this has to do with what we call legal certainty. So, what European policymakers also want to do is provide a solid legal framework for AI systems so that entrepreneurs that want to build these systems don't have to face a lot of legal uncertainty when developing them and being turned away from the market. It is true that right now, AI entrepreneurs are very aware of what they have to do. It might be very difficult, it might be very stringent, but they know there is a single point of reference, there is one law across Europe. And so a hope and the aim is that this will actually cultivate some legal certainty and help entrepreneurs. And now, something that is also very related to that is what Europe tries to adopt as its competitive advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world, which is all about trust in digital technologies. So what Europe tries to, and what European entrepreneurs can adopt as a competitive advantage, is that they can go around the world pitching their AI systems, pitching their AI products as being the ones that are most compliant with the most stringent regulation in the world. And that provides citizens and consumers in other regions with a lot of trust in these products. So I'd say that's also the final element and how Europe tries to position itself in this very competitive global market.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point that I do want to touch on before maybe getting into maybe how the AI Act, from your perspective, may impact the operations or adoption of AI technologies moving forward. But I think the competitive advantage that Europe builds and maintains in terms of ensuring trust in digital technology, I think is a good one. And I think there have been some, papers describing it as kind of like the Brussels policy effect in terms of potentially setting ambitious or stricter standards or laws that may lead to more widespread compliance or uniformity across the globe, and maybe the EU taking a leading position in terms of setting an ambitious kind of compliance target and understanding that there may be some kind of learning curve or investment associated with complying with those regulations, but that once met would mean for kind of more scalability across jurisdictions moving forward, or potentially the harmonization of other jurisdictions, whether North America, other continents, kind of aligning future laws with requirements that come out of the European Union. So do you see that kind of phenomenon playing out within the AI space? What role do you see the EU playing in terms of developing international standards and regulations for AI?
Yeah. I think that's very important because that's also something that went into the consideration of the lawmakers that came up with the AI Act. To provide some context, this dates back to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was proposed back in 2016 and became a regulatory success. It undoubtedly was diffused globally, adopted by companies across the global operations, which in turn advised a lot of countries to also start passing laws that were very similar to the GDPR in Latin America and the Middle East, even in Asia. And so European policymakers were hoping that by moving fast and being the first ones to regulate an AI, they would have the same effect as the GDPR had for data and set the global standard for AI. I have to say, though, that this time it might be more difficult. And there are several reasons going into that. First one being, of course, that we live in a very different era than 2016, and AI is a much more contested technology geopolitically than data is. And we have seen that actually play in practice because a lot of other jurisdictions have already moved with different approaches. And some examples here could be the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, who have adopted their own kind of AI strategies or AI regulations, if you will, that are much, much lighter than the European approach. And in all the government documents of either the US, the UK, Japan, you could see how these governments are trying to differentiate themselves from the European Union. They're emphasizing how their approach is pro-innovation, more friendly for entrepreneurship. And so we have already seen how the AI Act is to have, let's say, more global success. There are some positive cases. Brazil is one case in where the Senate introduced a bill that was more similar to the AI Act than other governments, but so far, most major geopolitical powers have chosen to pursue their own path in order to fulfill their strategic objectives.
I think that's a great point. And obviously, here in the US, we do a lot of government helps guide or support kind of a standards-based approach to technology innovation. And I think that standards can bring a certain amount of uniformity and consistency, maybe for elements of technology that don't represent huge competitive advantages. Take what is the form and the requirements for a USB-C charger on a mobile device. Ideally, you're not buying your mobile for the way in which it charges. And so companies can agree on that. I guess two-part question. First is, how do you envision maybe some of those AI standards or regulatory requirements improving the effectiveness or usability of AI models and tools? And then I guess on the flip side, are there regulations that may unintentionally constrain innovation that we need to be aware of?
Absolutely. I'll probably start from the second part because I'd say that's also very important to bring at this point in this conversation because, of course, we have to talk about how entrepreneurs in Europe are also concerned about the AI Act and what its impact in their competitiveness may be. And it is very early to tell. The AI Act is going through a legal process of becoming enforced in Europe, and we'll have to wait at least a couple of years before we know its full impact on the competitiveness. But there have been some studies, some very rigorous and reliable studies. And something that is very interesting to see is how much will actually these regulations and standards cost entrepreneurs. And some estimates range from 100,000 euros to 300,000 euros for their first year operations of an AI business in a high risk sector, and then 70,000 euros each year after that. And these kinds of sums of money are exactly to kind of implement some more complex standards, such as quality management systems, risk management systems. These things are very costly. And of course, it is not bigger companies that will be affected from these kinds of financial restrictions, but these small businesses, startups that may be turned away from these costs or actually not be able to succeed in rounding up investments to start their journeys. However, there are definitely also a positive side to these standards. They are definitely like a guide for these entrepreneurs to, as I said, ensure trust in their products and also ensure that there is this kind of like minimum level of competitiveness where each entrepreneurs can start from and kind of like differentiate later in the cycle of their business. However, these initial costs are definitely staggering, and it is something that the EU will have to examine if these estimates are to be realized, how we can actually cut this cost down or alleviate some of this financial burden from entrepreneurs.
Yeah. And I'm just taking that, looking at, there are some certain investment costs and recurring maintenance costs to ensure compliance or reporting requirements associated with the EU AI Act that small and large businesses will likely have to incur moving forward. From your perspective, are there specific adjustments that European companies will need to make to thrive under the new regulations? I guess, what are you going to be looking for over the next 6 to 12 months or beyond to see how this legislation is impacting European companies?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely essential. And The trend in the last 5 years in Europe has showed us that entrepreneurs must definitely become more policy and more legislation savvy. In order to be able to comply as better as you can, the time to start preparing was yesterday, actually. The second best time is right now. So entrepreneurs, whether they're running a business by their own or they're having a small team, they have to understand that their product goes beyond the narrow product that they're developing. It also intervenes with very complex regulations, and they have to start becoming much more aware of these regulations. And that does not only mean reading the text online, but also engaging directly with the local representatives, with the people they voted in office in order to defend their interests and the interests of their constituencies. It is very important to have an open dialogue with policymakers, with legislators, in order to understand the legislation and making sure that if updates are to happen, these are informed by the entrepreneurs. And then the final part of this strategy of becoming more policy savvy has also to do with becoming more aware of the resources that governments will start providing entrepreneurs in order to thrive. One of the most characteristic examples has to do with regulatory sandboxes, which is one of these mechanisms that the AI Act introduces in order to allow entrepreneurs to innovate more freely in a safe environment that is not regulated. And entrepreneurs have to understand these kind of like opportunities when they come up and take advantage of them, whether it is a regulatory sandbox, whether it is a funding opportunity coming from government, whether it is access to supercomputing capacity. They have to be in the room where these decisions are happening.
I think that's a great point, and something that in my day-to-day job, we're considering what are the products, services, resources that government agencies, mainly here in the US for our firm, but what are the offerings that would make a more competitive technology ecosystem? And I think you talked through testing environments or test beds or testing capabilities, whether it's calibrating instruments, providing data, providing maybe elements of a prototypical model that have been vetted and cleared by, high quality scientists that are government employees, obviously funding opportunities. I like the idea of providing access to computing capacity or recommendations on that front. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that government has a very positive, supportive role to play in helping economic actors, small businesses, large businesses kind of thrive in this AI environment. And I think reading through some of the AI Act requirements, obviously the risk classification kind of structure is a key controller of the specific rules that are being applied to specific classes of AI applications. But I guess taking a step back, are there any specific AI risks that you think are most pressing or most important for government or private industry to keep in mind today?
Definitely in Europe, I would say that the AI Act takes a very comprehensive approach. So I'd say it definitely covers all risks. It is true that the later kind of like drafts of the AI Act made the risk-based approach all the more complicated. I think a lot of the audience is probably familiar with the European pyramid of AI risks, going from the prohibiting risks classification to the high risks to the minimal risks. However, as the law was being amended and modified, it became all the more complicated. So it is not enough, for example, to be in one of these categories. You have to also fulfill certain criteria. And going back a bit to the previous question, is definitely important for entrepreneurs to understand what kind of risk classification they go into, because it is not as straightforward as it may seem through the pyramid scheme. But one specific kind of like issue that might occupy policymakers in the next few years, especially in Europe, could be the military risks of AI, or the risks that the military AI application poses. Now, the European AI Act does not deal with those risks, and the reason it has to do more with the structure of the European Union and its legal basis. Anything that has to do with military, anything that has to do with security, remains competence of the member states, of the different countries comprising the European Union, and therefore the EU does not have any jurisdictions on these matters. However, these are also very real risks, and as more and more AI applications in the military are being developed and are being tested in military bases all around Europe, we might start seeing how these faults may put their users at risk, or even citizens at risk. So it is definitely something that we might see in the next few years. Each individual country start taking their own approach to military AI risks.
Yeah. And I think that when I think of AI risk, I mean, it can be providing access to sensitive or private data on the user side, or if it's classified or government owned information. Obviously, that needs to be controlled and safeguarded. Can't be used at scale for certain models. And I think empowering users with the control and selectivity to share their data with models that they maybe opt into is a really important consideration to keep in mind. And even as something as simple as the reliability, accuracy, or trustworthiness of a model output. I mean, there are significant kind of decision-making risks that would be associated with a model that isn't performing as expected or providing misleading information. So I think, having a clear understanding of risks and kind of contingency plans or building in controls into the model structure itself would be helpful as well. I guess in terms of geopolitical factors influencing AI development and deployment across different regions, are there specific requirements or priorities that you've observed European nations kind of prioritizing into AI policy development or AI tool operations that may be different than what you see in the US or in Asia or other regions?
Absolutely. And there is definitely, I think, something that is also very important to mention is that while the EU might legislate as one body, it becomes a European regulations, there are definitely different approaches inside the EU, and the different countries very much disagree with what the approach must be. And what people see from the United States, from China as the AI Act regulation is actually the result of a lot of compromises of these different approaches. For example, even within the EU, we saw how in the AI Act negotiations, countries such as Germany, France, and Italy were arguing for a less stringent approach and something that they were thinking would be a more pro-innovation approach. And that has definitely to do with the fact that these countries host some of the most prominent European AI champions. We know, for example, Mistral came from France, Aleph Alpha is another prominent startup from Germany. And so there are a lot of differences in how European nations even themselves approach this issue. And then we can also see how globally different states approach AI regulation or AI innovation, depending on the issues at hand. We know, for example, of course, how in China, the priority for the Chinese government has to do a lot with censorship and surveillance in order to maintain social stability and political control. Whereas in the US and lately in the UK, we also see how the approach has more to do with innovation. Even more so, I would argue, in the US, which views AI very much as part of the competition with China. And it makes it almost imperative that the US gains a competitive advantage over China, and that very stringent digital regulations may actually curb this competitiveness that US firms hold in this field. So we have definitely seen the emergence of this geopolitical landscape where each actor tries to specialize and adjust their approach based on their different strengths. And we'll definitely see more of that in the next few years.
I think that's a great point. And I did notice a recent LinkedIn post where you talked about maybe some cultural, structural, or even financial funding differences between the way in which the EU supports its technology innovation ecosystem versus the US or China or other regions and things of that nature. Are there specific factors that, make it difficult to support kind of the same level of innovation in Europe as in the US? Or are there specific recommendations from your perspective for how Europe can foster additional entrepreneurial activity or investment within its tech industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I wrote a kind of like Twitter thread and LinkedIn post that went a bit viral, got over 1.7 million views, which was actually based on a study that Professor Anu Bradford from Columbia conducted, where she argued that there are some structural differences that can actually explain the innovation gap between the United States and Europe that don't necessarily have to do with tech regulation. And there are several factors that's mentioned in this very interesting study. I might go through a couple of them in the time that we have. But first of all, it has definitely to do with scalability. As I said, again, the European Union is not a uniform body. It is actually comprised of 27 different countries. And although we do talk about the single market, there are still a lot of differences between these countries, from regulations to languages to cultural barriers. So a European entrepreneur has a much more difficult time to scale their operation across the continent than a US entrepreneur would have. So that's definitely one factor. Another factor that is very interesting to mention has to do with risk. and how much risk US entrepreneurs are willing to take vis-a-vis their European counterparts. Now, there are two factors going into kind of like being more risk averse or more risk prone, and they are both legal and cultural. Legal has to do, of course, with bankruptcy laws, and we know how more lenient bankruptcy laws can encourage innovation and growth and excellence in the AI field. And there is a very interesting study from the OECD which calculated the personal costs of entrepreneurship in different jurisdictions. And they measured things such as the number of years it takes you to be discharged from your debts as an entrepreneur, or your exemptions that you're given. For example, what kind of assets you can exempt from a bankruptcy process. And they actually found out that the cost of being an entrepreneur in the case of bankruptcy were the lowest in the US and Canada, and the highest in European countries such as the Czech Republic and Portugal. And that, of course, has also to do with more cultural perspectives on risk. One can very much argue that in Europe, failing is seen very negatively, whereas in the US and kind of like the Silicon Valley culture, failure is something to be proud of almost, is something that is necessary for you in order to reach the success. And so these are a couple of structural differences between the US and Europe. We can talk about many more as well, the finance environment, the immigration environment as well. But they provide a good explanation of why we see so much difference when it comes to technology innovation between the two counterparts.
Yeah. And I did want to talk a little bit about immigration or attracting a top tier AI capable workforce, and then maybe some strategies for equipping the existing workforce for, workplace transitions that may be spurred by AI. So I guess, could you elaborate somewhat on the role that you see immigration in diversifying or strengthening the tech workforce, and any specific changes that you or recommendations that you would identify for government to attract, retain, and empower AI capable employees?
Yeah, absolutely. I would argue that immigration is an essential kind of like tool when it comes to what we're calling the global battle for tech talent. Of course, AI is already becoming a very specialized endeavor and requires talent to build these sophisticated models. So, of course, in this kind of like global race to reach AI supremacy, it is very important to have the right talent. And if you cannot create all the talent, maybe one idea could be to find specific channels of immigration in order to attract such talent. And we have seen how the US in the past has benefited a lot from its immigration regime and culture, inviting talented people from all over the world. And a lot of success stories in the US were actually created from entrepreneurs that were immigrants. And so it is definitely very important for Europe as well to adopt specific measures and start branding itself and presenting itself as the most attractive global destination for tech talent. And the most simple instrument to implement that would be a tech talent visa for foreign workers. It can be as simple as that, especially at a time where the US started implementing and maintaining a more tighter immigration policy, and something that actually might become even tighter if in the case that Republican candidate Donald Trump is elected in the White House this November. Now, there are some schemes in Europe in order to attract more specialized talent. There is a scheme called the Blue Card, but they have so far met limited success. And there are various reasons for that. You stumble again to the fact that, again, we have 27 different countries. They implement the Blue Card scheme in different ways, and that makes it less effective. But also the fact that the Blue Card comes right now with a specific salary threshold. I believe today this salary threshold is about 45,000 euros annually of income, which may turn away people that are more entrepreneurial, which may actually record lower salaries in the first or second year of their enterprise, or as they're trying to put every penny back into their enterprises to make it work. And so these are details, but they actually may end up turning away a lot of talented people that may want to come to Europe and build their success stories.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I know, of course, AI applications and systems may automate jobs outside of the, technology industry as well. And so I know here in the United States, there are a variety of different workforce development initiatives to train an AI capable or a semiconductor capable workforce, whether if it's postgraduate kind of research applications or more lab technician or specialized roles at various elements of the AI supply chain. Have you observed any sort of European activities related to workforce development that prepare economies for AI job automation or equipping kind of the population to get smart on some of these technologies in order to be well equipped as the economies transition forward?
Yeah, I'd say, unfortunately, this is one of the major disadvantages Europe faces right now when it comes to skill shortages, and not only in skill shortages, but also the diffusion of AI into different businesses. Because we have talked a bit about the development of AI and building companies that develop cutting edge AI models. But it's not only about that. Actually, we also need to focus at the same time on how more traditional sectors, traditional businesses that may not be tech savvy and they don't need to hire top talent from top universities in the world. However, all of the traditional sectors need to adapt to these new technologies and adapt AI into their operations. And as I said, unfortunately, Europe lags behind on that sector. Latest numbers is that only 11% of businesses apply AI into their operations in Europe right now. And actually, the objective for the EU is to reach 75% of businesses by 2030. So we have about 6 years to cover a ground of 64% of all businesses in Europe to adopt AI. So while there haven't been any specific initiatives to start accelerating this kind of process, I believe we will start seeing much more of that. I believe we'll start seeing much more of AI becoming an integral part of educational system across Europe, of the university systems, and connecting the educational systems with also the business sectors in order to supply them with the talent that is needed to make these changes.
Yeah. And are there other kind of government or public facing use cases for AI that you see providing strong impact or being really compelling as we move forward? I know you touched on educational, maybe curriculum or materials development. Are there other kind of government functions that could benefit with expanded use of AI tools or systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say every kind of like public service that governments offer right now can definitely become by implementing an AI dimension to it, from interacting with citizens to providing necessarily a documentation to making, starting a business more of a quick process. Everything can be simplified with AI. But what is, of course, very crucial when it comes to government services is also keeping humans in the loop and making sure that not the entire processes are being automatized, because especially when we're talking about government services, we're talking about more critical kind of like functions for citizens. And it is very important that we don't start seeing an automation that is very flawed and that creates more challenges and more difficulties for citizens that it actually helps them solve.
Great. Well, I think we've got time for another question or two, but I guess revisiting maybe the EU AI Act, how do you envision this regulation impacting the competitiveness of European tech companies on the global stage? Are there any additional thoughts that you have on that front and how companies can adapt to accommodate some of the AI requirements or regulations?
Well, I'd say, as I mentioned before, the absolute competitive advantage that it gives European companies is this trust function. So I think it is very important for entrepreneurs to keep that in mind and revisit their branding strategies, revisit their communication strategies, and make sure that if they're complying with the AI Act, they let their customers, they let citizens know in order for them to actually take advantage of this kind of compliance. However, as I said, this compliance comes with a heavy financial cost. So it's very important to take this into the cost benefit consideration. And going back to entrepreneurs becoming more political savvy, it is very important to see how we can actually start cutting down this cost. And the AI Act very much remains kind of like a living animal in the sense that the European Commission holds a lot of power to continue updating in the future, to make sure it is relevant, to make sure it doesn't tip too much the scale when it comes to balancing innovation and regulation. And so what is important for policymakers is also to continue monitoring the competitiveness of European companies abroad and inside Europe and update the legislation if needed.
And from your perspective, are there other AI policy needs that require urgent attention from either European lawmakers or lawmakers in other regions?
As I mentioned before, military AI is definitely something that might keep us occupied in the next coming of years. And then the other kind of sector that is becoming all the more prominent has to do with AI in the workforce and how AI interacts with workers, and also the issues of liability that arise in that. In the European Union, it has definitely become a much more contested issue, and a lot of labor unions are bringing up the issue that an AI in the workforce regulation may be needed in order to protect workers' rights as well, that have to deal with these systems every day, and kind of the risk that it may pose either to their day-to-day jobs or also the threat of automation that may pose to them.
And any closing advice that you would give to government leaders and policymakers who are considering integrating AI into their communication strategies, policy development processes, or general operations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is very important to keep in mind that we are far away from AI systems being able to provide with a consistent quality output that doesn't have any mistakes. So the key thing for government leaders, policymakers, is to realize that no system is perfect and do not expect flawless outputs. So it is important to keep using AI as a tool and keeping humans in the loop, keeping humans in the work processes so that they're able to review and question AI outputs in order to both make them more efficient, but also retain something that I think is very valuable, which is the human element, especially when we're talking about communication strategies, policy development. The human element is indispensable. And so it is something definitely to keep into consideration.
Great. Well, Giorgos, I appreciate your time here this afternoon. And I guess any closing thoughts or examples of where people can check out more of your work or hear your thoughts on the subject as we close?
Absolutely. I invite our audience to check the work that the European Council on Foreign Relations is doing at ecfr.eu. And they can also find me on LinkedIn or Twitter at Giorgos Verdi.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And we will talk to you soon. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.